Regarding the agenda for tonight, so I'm going to take you through a deal that an agent brought to me, and how using TPN gave me some great insights into that area as to what the delinquency rates might be, and I was able to vet the deal using that data. And then I'm going to hand over to our guest speaker, Michelle Dickens from TPN, and she's going to take us through a presentation of investment grade suburbs and using live real data. So it's going to be a really interesting data driven presentation. So, the quick testimonial or case study of my using TPN. This was a deal brought to me by a sourcing agent. So it's a block of flats. There's 8 2 bedrooms in Cape Town. At a high level, the deal looked quite interesting, right? At an asking price of 2.5 million for 8 units. That's not too bad, and there's a slight discount of 6%. The agent was sort of predicting a return of investment of 31%. Now, on paper, this looked really good and exciting and interesting. I think the question I had is, what about the area? What's the risk of investing in this kind of area? Um, the property, was in good condition. We actually viewed it over the course of Monday. And it was recently renovated. The reason the owner was selling is he wanted to immigrate, and he planned to actually rent this out as student accommodation, but then COVID hit, he got scared, and now he's just trying to sell. He's trying to cut his losses. So in really good condition. Here's a bit more detail as to how the sourcing agent was coming up with their numbers. So the rental income in this specific area was estimated at 50,000 Rand for the 8 units. Now, I don't know this area. So my first question that I'm thinking is, how can I justify that 50,000? How can I get proof or evidence that 50,000 Rand in rental is something that I can achieve? So that's a key question, and a key question that can be answered using TPN's data. So what I did is I downloaded a TPN investor report for the area to try and understand what are the demographics, what are the behaviors like in that area. So the first part of the report that stood out for me was the price trends. Sectional title property, here you can see that they're averaging around 5,500 per unit, right? So what I can do, say 5,500 times 8, that gives me 44,000 Rand. That is probably what the average rent for this area would be. So it gives us a sense as to, is that 50,000 Rand realistic or not? So with 44,000 Rand as the rental, that's 6,000 less than what the investor or the sourcing agent was offering me. So that's not an accurate number, right? Now, without even knowing the area or having gone or seen any financials, I'm able to use data-driven information to make an informed decision. The other key question around the calculation of the sourcing agent is the void cost. Now, void, for those new to the game, is essentially a provision you put in place for the inevitable vacancy of a unit. Now, your vacancy could be based on delinquent behavior. It could be just a tenant moving on. And you need to establish or understand what the risk in the particular area is so you can justify your provision. Now, going through the TPN investor report, there's some key sort of statistics that really add to your decision making. The one for me is employment status. Here you can see roughly in this area, there's an 11.82% unemployment rate. I wouldn't say that that's a unrealistically high number. Michelle, actually, from your perspective, what kind of numbers should we be looking at here? What would be for you the area of concern?
So employment numbers, Lawrence, are vastly dependent on an area and the demographics of an area. And as we know, we've got an incredibly high unemployment rate, 34% at the moment. And in fact, in our in our youth, that number for the expanded number goes up to 74%. So it's a combination of both what are the demographics of the age of the area, as well as what is the demographics of the employment versus unemployment. That's going to give us kind of a leading indicator to what we can expect from a good standing ratio. And the good standing ratio would then be, well, how is rent actually paid within an area? So for me, the age of the area will be a leading indicator into the employment status, which would then be a leading indicator into the actual good standing ratio of how tenants are paying.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. What about annual income levels? So the amount of earnability that also, I guess, factors in.
So this is gonna factor into your affordability calculation. So one of the components of whether or not you get a high good standing. So let's talk about good standing. Good standing on average in South Africa at the moment is 80%. What does that mean? It means that 80%, 8 in 10 tenants, are fully settled with their rental accounts by the end of the month. That's great because we were at 73% in the hard lockdown quarter. So there's been a nice gradual growing improvement. Look, we're not at the 86% that we were in 2013 and 2014, but the economy's been on a long, slow decline from that period. So what we want to know is, from an affordability perspective, if the tenant doesn't have the income to meet the rental that they need to be paying on a monthly basis, that is going to impact on the ability of the tenant to pay
Sure.
their account in full.
Sure. Because I can see with this specific area that there's only a 50% ratio of the people living there that could actually afford 5,500 rand in rent. Again, I guess that's quite common when you come to lower income areas or your inner cities. Is that your experience as well?
Absolutely. So what we found is that the lower income side of the market, tenants will typically contribute about 42% of their income towards rental, whereas as the rental amount starts to increase, you'll see that ratio drops to about 30%. So the more low income households are contributing more income towards rent than the middle income households are contributing.
Sure. So, I mean, this leads us to how I would determine the delinquency rate. So, exactly what Michelle is saying here, your good standing ratio. Now, the good standing ratio is broken down into these different categories where you can see the percentage in a specific suburb, province, or nationwide. Who's paid on time, grace period, paid late, partial payment, and did not pay. And then you can see the good standing ratio, which is the calculation of the first three numbers, gives you a percentage of the 100 that your tenant is going to be paying on time. So as Michelle mentioned, there's a sort of a 78 to 80% current. Well, sorry, Michelle, you said it's 80% currently
80% at the moment. That
nationwide.
78.25 that was the previous quarter. So we've been watching it literally month by month. And not even month by month, Lawrence. I'm literally
Yeah,
looking at it every single day to see if there's a shift or a change in behavior. And we're kind of
sure.
flatlining at that 80% at the moment.
Yeah. So this 4 out of 10 is, I mean, this is evidence of it being a very high risk area.
This is very high risk area.
Yeah.
I think you've outperformed any of my future slides in this particular area,
Oh,
Lawrence.
really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know anything about this area. It's and yeah, I mean TPN really helped me with that. So the void cost here of 3,000 rand, which is what was budgeted for me, would be too little. That's maybe a 6% provision that you're putting aside. For high risk area like this, I would be putting between sort of 15 and 20% of the rental income needs to go into some sort of kitty or budget for delinquent or void costs. Um, but yeah, another thing that the sourcing agent used to justify this proposal to me was some of the future benefits of holding the property. Now, in order to determine what your future benefits or returns are going to look like, you need to have some variables. One of the key ones is what we call the rental increase. So obviously, year on year, you're going to be hopefully charging your tenants slightly more. Um, but depending on the area, you could sometimes charge 5%, 10%, 8%. Now, if you're inaccurate with that number, you're not going to get accurate future projections. And one of the things that the TPN report for me does, it gives you that kind of potential of greater returns in the future. Now, the area that this deal is in Camelot, which is in the Western Cape. And Here, the color legend basically says that it's got a low chance of going up in rent year on year or next year. So there's probably a chance that it's going to be going down. So all of that has kind of factored into my decision making to say, look, the deal made sense on the surface, but based on this data driven approach, I can now actually work out the accurate numbers. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing the proposal from the sourcing agent in terms of what they were offering. Here, I've just rerun the numbers using what I've learned from TPN. So reduce the rent because 5,500 is realistic in that area. I've added a 12.5% void because I see it as a very high risk investment. And essentially, the cash flow is now sitting at sort of 6,000 with the return on investment for 13%. I mean, 13% is decent. If you compare that to the bank, you're getting, 3 times what you could get in a normal savings account. But I think for the risk you're about to take, just doesn't justify. Anyway, that was a quick testimonial just as to, how, you can use TPN to understand an area that you would have in otherwise no knowledge about and make, pretty informed decisions. Now, without further ado, thank you so much again for joining us. And yeah, let's hear your go.
Oh, divine. Thanks so much, Lawrence. And I'm happy to share some investment grade suburb reports to our viewers tonight. And I'm happy to take questions. So, Lawrence, if you have a question that pops up, I really am quite comfortable. You can interrupt me, and happy to chat. What I thought I'd do was I always like to just start with how big the market size is, and I realize that this screen can be quite overwhelming. It's Stats SA data, and it speaks to the total number of households that are in rented accommodation at the moment. So in South Africa, we have 17 million households, of which 22% of those are in rented accommodation. High level numbers, 3 million are in formal rental accommodation. But if I take out the million of the tenants that are in a room, a granny flat, or in a backyard dwelling, that drops down to 2 million. So 2 million households live in rental accommodation, in formal rental accommodation in South Africa. And that's kind of the demand side, right? That's the number of tenants that are out there looking for rental accommodation. I'm going to talk about the risks. So Lawrence, you spoke about the risks, and I'm going to talk about the risks first. And I'm going to talk about the delinquency risk. So this is the risk of your tenant not paying the rent. And then I'm going to talk about the risk of vacancy. So this is both of these being Lawrence's void costs. So the risk of the property standing vacant and not being able to place a tenant in it. The numbers that I'm talking about at the moment are national, right? So different areas are going to perform differently. But nationally, we're at the moment 80% of South African tenants are in good standing with their rent as of Q2, and that means 8 in 10 tenants.
Sorry, Michelle.
Yes.
There's something so striking for me in terms of how badly the commercial market was hit during the pandemic.
Terrible.
Why is that the case?
1 in 2 tenants in the commercial market were in good standing in Q2. And this was driven particularly by the retail market, which dropped down to 40%. Only 4 in 10 tenants were in good standing with their rent in the retail sector, the office and the industrial market holding up the best. And you can see there's recovery back to 67% of tenants in good standing. A lot was driven. There was a 3 billion rand rent relief provided by the listed companies into the commercial market.
Sure.
And this provided some level of relief to the commercial market, but you can see it's still sitting at 67%. So effectively what's happened at the moment is we're actually only left with 14% non-payment, which is getting close back to where it was at 7% prior to the lockdown. The biggest challenge in the commercial market at the moment is the partial payments. At its worst, in Q2, that was 30% of commercial tenants were in a partial paid status. And because of all of those relief packages that were offered over the last 12 months, the commercial tenants have been slowly clawing their way out of that. So partial payments down to 22% from 30%. Which means that the tenants are improving. The reality, though, is, Lawrence, that the weakness in the market, you look at it from a good standing perspective, the reality is that the weakness in the market is really being felt more in the vacancy rates. both in resi and in commercial.
Michelle, there's actually a good question here from Tabang, which I thought I'd quickly pose to you. So he says from the brief presentation, it seems like township property investors are not really catered for, as this data are for areas in nicer suburbs. Is that how far does the tool spread in terms of the data it can provide?
No, 100%. And we are in township markets. We're not as strong as we would like to be in township markets. I have got some Soweto data that I'm going to share with you at the moment, but we are in all townships. When I talk about residential tenants in good standing, it includes so it's formal housing in townships. It's not informal housing in townships. Let me say it like that. And it includes things. So we've got rooms from 500 Rand a room as our starting point. And in fact, 15% of our data relates to data of rentals less than 3,000 Rand per month. And then we go all the way up to sort of 180,000 Rand houses in Camps Bay. The majority, 70% of the data on our database relates to leases that are less than 7,000 Rand per month. 35%, 1 in 3 tenants rent for between 4,500 and 7,000 Rand.
That's the sweet spot, that sort of lower income market.
Yeah, I would say we've shifted a little bit. The 7,000 to 12,000 is now the sweet spot. But 4 to 7 is still lovely. It's still a lovely place.
But we're talking now just delinquency rates, eh?
Right. The sweet spot, when I talk about for a sweet spot, I'm talking about across the board. So yields, vacancies, collectability, delinquency, etc., etc., etc.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, so we've got this delinquency rate. You've got a 2 in 10, a 20% chance of having a delinquent tenant. The reality is that the majority of that sits in partial payment. So you've only got at the moment an 8% chance of full-on non-payment, and in fact, only 1 in 4 tenants are going to be so delinquent. 1.4%. 1.4% of tenants are going to be so delinquent that they're going to squat in your property for more than 4 months, and that's an increase from less than 1% prior to the lockdown.
Sure. Where would student accommodation fit in this model?
Student accommodation sits in our residential model as well. What you don't see in this particular slide, though, is that the challenge for our student accommodation landlords is that Q1 is a very, very delinquent period. The tenants recover, and it's just because NSFAS pays out late, right?
Yes, so late, yeah.
There's a full recovery when you get to Q2, Q3. And Q4, you sit on par. So you're not losing. It's just a cash flow problem that you're dealing with. Yeah. And if you get the tenant's parent or guardian to pay, the student's parent or guardians to pay, then your collection rate improves by 12%. So you absolutely have these mechanisms that you can call on to improve your collection rate.
Fantastic.
Okay. Next, we've got this. What does the market look like? Because market strength, supply and demand, determines whether you have vacancies or not, and the level of vacancies is going to determine your escalation. So the first thing that we want to look at in this particular slide is the gray shading in the background. Now you'll see a blue dotted line. This blue dotted line at 50 is equilibrium, and any gray shaded area over the blue dotted line tells us that this is a market with excess demand. Fabulous, lots of tenants to choose from. As the blue dotted line, the grey shading deteriorates below the blue dotted line, as it has done since 2018. This tells us a market that there's excess supply of rental stock, but not enough tenants looking for property. And you can see the market strength dipping from 69, nearly 70, all the way down to 44. So right now we're in a market that doesn't have enough demand for the supply that's being produced. 2 things happening there. We have got more supply being produced. Areas like the Western Cape during the lockdown, we had properties coming off the short-term Airbnb market and into the long-term market. That increases your supply. On top of that, you also have decreasing demand, as we had 2.2 million people lose their jobs in the hard lockdown quarter. And yes, we have had more people getting back into full-time employment, but we're still down overall. And that means that you have a shrinking market of tenants looking. So if you've got a market where you've got excess supply and not enough tenants, what does that do? Well, it increases your vacancies. And you can see in the hard lockdown quarter, we're at around about 7.5% vacancy rate. We go into the hard lockdown period, and for 3 months, we were kind of teetering on 13%, 12.9%, 13.3%, 13.13% for those 3 quarters. And then I'm very pleased to see that number's come back down in this last Q3, and we're now sitting at 10.6%. Sure, that's still double digits, but what it's done is it is receding, it is coming back down. So if you have high vacancies, you have a tenants market. And if tenants have the choice of properties to choose from, that of course drives down your escalation. I was laughing on your slide where you put in a 10% escalation. A 10% escalation was last seen, I don't know when. So, I mean, in 2016, we were sitting at a 5.5% national escalation. And sure, in the Western Cape, it was sitting higher than that. Up until 2018.
So yeah, wow, that's interesting.
So,
sorry.
No, not at all. So you've got this escalation rate dropping, and then we go through the hard lockdown quarter, and it turns negative by the end of last year. Pleasingly, though, we're back into positive territory, but not for everyone. Gauteng is still sitting with a negative national escalation. Western Cape is still sitting with a negative a negative escalation for its particular province.
Right. Are there any positive, or what are the high-performing provinces?
So our high-performing provinces will be KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. Why? More so the Eastern Cape, because there's not a lot of new development going on there. And so if there's not a lot of new development going on, you don't have a market strength that's out of kilter. So your market strength in KwaZulu-Natal is still sitting at 50%, which is on equilibrium. That's fantastic. And in Eastern Cape, your market strength is sitting above 50%. So you still have a market with more demand than what you have supply. And that helps to drive up your overall escalation in those areas.
Sure.
So, I mean, what everyone's mostly interested in, right, is, well, what are my returns? So, sure, if we buy a property, we know our risks, and we're going to factor in our voids. We know that there's non-payment in certain areas, and we know that there's going to be vacancies in certain areas. And we're going to get into those in a moment. If we look at the FNB house, so what drives yield? What is a gross yield? Let's quickly do the calculation. A gross yield is very simply when you take the annual rent. So I'm taking a property of 3,000 Rand rent per month. My annual rent is then 3,000 times 12. That's 36,000 Rand. If my market value of that particular property is 300,000 Rand, can you see my rent is 3,000, 1% of my market value, 300,000. My gross yield then on that calculation will be 12%. So what's important then to understand what drives your yield is your rental value and your house price increase value. And you want to see your market value of a house go up.
Sure.
So if all things stay equal, and your rental escalation, as what we're watching here, is slowing down. It's getting weaker. There's the rental escalation getting weaker. And in fact, it turned negative. Well, if your escalation turns negative and the value of your rent decreases and the market value of your property stays the same, your yield decreases. Your yield gets less. You got less money in for your property.
So Michelle, what would you, seeing this data now, as an investor myself, what would you say I should project my capital appreciation to be for let's say Gauteng?
This is house price index nationally, and can you see that in 2014 they were sitting at 8%? And remember what I said earlier? We've been on the slow economic weakening. All the data has been weakening since 2013. And you can see the FNB house price index here. This is the dark blue line. And it's deteriorating to just prior to lockdown, it was 1.2%. We then had this nice little improvement in house price growth up to 4.6%. But there were a couple of things that were driving this. And one of those is because we had 15% less transactions in that year than we had the year before. And that was already a deterioration in the number of house price transactions for the preceding 2 years. So let's go back to 2004, 5, 6, when we were in the house price boom period, and we had house price index increasing at between 20 and 30% per annum. That was in 2003, 4, 5. That party is over, and we've been in this super cycle of very flat house price growth. It's been propped up by the Western Cape. If you look at somewhere like Gauteng, that has been very, very low. In fact, in some instances, negative. This is nominal. When you take in the price of inflation, your asset is actually deteriorating in value when you take that into account. What does that mean for your yield? Well, this is a double whammy. What went on here in the hard lockdown is a double whammy for your yield.
Yeah.
If your house price is increasing and your rent is going backwards, your yield goes backwards. So what I've done here in this particular graph is I've taken your sectional title yields nationally, and you can see that they were 10.7%, and there's been a slow deterioration to 10.3%. Now, I know the graph looks a lot worse. So, I mean, that's 0.4% decrease. The point is that gone are the days where you could buy a property, sell it a year later for 20% extra. You bought it off plan, and so you never actually paid the bond. You never paid a single cent towards the property, and you had a 20% growth. Those days, that party is long, long, long gone. The reality is that in order to make any investment work, you need to be buying these properties at a discount. You can't be buying at market value. You've got to be buying at a discount. You've got to seriously know what your costs are. So what is the real rent that I can achieve on this property? And what costs, what levies, what rates and taxes, what additional repairs and maintenance? The numbers are tight. And in order for you to make real profit, return on investment, a lot of work has to go into the numbers. Reality, there's no fat. There's no fat in the market at the moment, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's look at Gauteng. What I've done here is I've taken the preceding slides that we've talked about, which is the good standing, that's in green. So what is the number of tenants they're going to pay? The delinquency would be the opposite of that. I then said, well, what is the other void that you can have? And that's your vacancies. And I've put those in gray. And then I've popped in the gross yield. Now, remember, the gross yield is not the net yield. It's the gross yield. You still would have to deduct your expenses to determine your income yield.
What's interesting for me is the Soweto market seems to have a very high gross yield.
You're pricing in risk versus reward. So only 44%.
Yeah,
and I was thinking about this slide when you showed me the one that you did of your area. I can't remember what it was. You got a 44% good standing ratio, which means that 56% of tenants in this area are not paying their rent.
Jeez. But the vacancy rate is at 10%.
Vacancy rate's at 10%, so that's not too bad either. But your yield's sitting at 13.8%. So remember, not everyone collects rent the same. Not everyone collects rent the same. So it's about the quality of the tenant that you place in the property that is fundamental to your ability to collect rent, plus doing proper affordability assessment. So it's not just about, has my tenant got a clean credit profile? It's about, has my tenant got a clean credit profile, and does he have the income to support the rental that he's applying for? And if you tick those two boxes, then you're able to achieve your 13.8% yield. Juxtapose that against the best performing suburb in terms of collections, which is Sandton at 85%. In other words, only 15% of tenants in this area are delinquent. The vacancy rate is down to 10.2%. Okay, that looks all right, except that last quarter it was 26%. So what did landlords in Sandton do in order to improve the vacancy rate from 26% to 10%? Well, they dropped their rentals back to 2017 rates. Why? Because we have an enormous overstocked, oversupplied area in the Sandton area. And why do we have overstocked, oversupplied area in Sandton? Well, we've had a lot of office to residential conversions, a lot of nano units coming into the market. And in 2018 and 2019, there was a lot of new construction in that area. So as people lost their jobs, vacancies went up. In order to curb vacancies, we dropped rentals.
So now, sorry, from my perspective as an investor, I'm looking for positive cash flow deals. So looking at this data, with that in mind, what is the best investment area for me to consider?
We're going to get to that in a moment.
Okay,
This is
sure.
just general. And Lawrence, I'm going to share these slides with you, and then you're very welcome to share them with
Great.
your viewers, and they can go through them in their
Awesome.
own time. Because high level data, to look at it quickly. Let's keep going. So
Awesome.
next
Great.
slide is now on the total returns, Joburg's top suburbs. I've taken us down one level. So in the previous slide, we were looking more at the town level. In this slide, we're now looking at the actual suburb level. Now, in order to do this data, what I did was I took all the suburbs in the Johannesburg area. Now, I've broadened it because I've got the West Rand in there. I've got the full Greater Joburg area, the East Rand, and the Northern suburbs. We take all those individual suburbs and we say, let's look at the capital yield of investment property. So I'm not looking on primary residence. I'm looking only at investment properties in the database. Let's look at the capital growth of the areas in the last 10 years. And I'm looking at it on a per annum basis. So if you were to look at somewhere like Sunny Rock on the East Rand, which is this first column over here, the blue indicates to me that around about 9% capital growth in Sunny Rock year on year for 10 years. So 9% per annum. The next section gives us the green section and the red section together would give us what the gross yield will be. In other words, Sunny Rock for capital growth and gross yield would give us 21% yield return every year per annum for the last 10 years. The red, the little top part of the red, is what is the delinquent component of that. And you can see we would have to deduct if our tenant behaved the same as the average tenant in that area, around about 3%, we'd have to deduct off for delinquency. So it's an area that's got like an average amount of delinquencies. Then let's go and have a look at Blaubostrand. Blaubostrand is in Randburg in the northern suburbs. Now you can expect to get also around about 20.5% return every year for the
That's very high. Eh? That's
but listen to how it works.
Okay.
Your capital growth, because you don't get your capital growth until you exit. So your capital growth in this Blaubostrand is around about 2%. In other words, what you would buy it for 10 years ago, you would be able to get 2% per annum back in capital growth. That is less than inflation. You've then got this opportunity.
So your capital is depreciating. Yeah, I see.
Right? You've then got this opportunity to get yourself up to just over 20% in terms of gross yield, except a whopping 8% of that is delinquents. In other words, we're taking off the delinquency rate within that area off your opportunity to get your gross yield. Again, going back to my Soweto story, it depends on your ability to place quality tenants. So if you look at the full stack, you can see what your opportunity is from a full stack perspective, but you've got to budget in your risk factor. And then you could say to yourself as a landlord, you know what, I'm really, that doesn't look great. If I just move to Fontainebleau, I've got a better capital growth opportunity and I've got a much less delinquency rate. So the point of this graph was simply to say, I want to look at all the suburbs in Gauteng, and I want to choose the top 20, which is what I did, if I was to add capital growth, income growth, and my opportunity from a delinquency perspective, if I was going to put all of that together. The graph would look substantially different if I was to say, well, you know what, I'm only interested in capital growth. What are the areas? I don't care about income growth. I'm purely a speculative buyer. I'm only interested in capital growth. What would my suburbs look like then? Or an area like Krugersdorp Central, where my main interest is income growth. What is my area that's is most suitable from an income growth perspective? And I think that's what I'm trying to assess in these best performing suburbs, is that depending on the investor's market plan, you're going to look at different suburbs very, very
Yeah.
different.
What I like about this graph is that you've displayed it so nicely in the sense that we can see a comparative summary against a property similar or suburb similar in a certain district. So let's say you're living in Johannesburg and you want to obviously make your investment area there. You can see now 5 relevant suburbs in one picture and say, okay, probably Bellevue's my best financial opportunity, but there's a substantial risk associated to that. In the northern suburbs, I mean, Bloberg versus Fontainebleau, you depicted it perfectly there, that it's a lower risk and similar returns to go just to that area instead of Bloberg. And I think that's
Absolutely.
what this data is telling us, is it's not opinions on agents giving us advice, it's based on data.
Exactly. Exactly. I'm gonna do Pretoria. Pretoria West always pops for me. Oh, I love Pretoria West, right? Um,
Yeah.
it's got fabulous capital. Well, fabulous. That's so funny. It's got acceptable capital growth. It's absolutely above inflation. It's got really nice income growth. And as I said, the delinquency rate it's higher than other areas within the Pretoria area, but for me, delinquencies can be managed in
Yeah.
terms of placement. The placement of the tenant, I just cannot state this importantly enough, or we see it in the data. Tenants, the time that a tenant on average takes to default, when they default, is month 3.5. And this tells me that the tenants that are defaulting, you could predict that. They were placed, and we see it again in the data. We score the tenants, and our F scoring tenants have an 80% once we place them, and we see that they've been placed. 80% of those F scoring tenants turn delinquent by month
Yo.
3.5. So it just tells me people are placing tenants with
What
their
about
eyes
what
wide
about
open.
C? Is because I've got a tenant currently who rated as a C on your credit score. What is that? Medium risk. That's a 30% chance. What are those numbers?
Yeah, so an A is an excellent tenant. From what we're seeing in the data, we don't expect them to default. And in order to get an A, you have to have other rental payment profiles. So we have to be able to see how you've paid your rent in the past. You don't get an A without that. A B tenant shows us that they've either got a quality behavior in terms of their rental payments, or if we're not seeing them as a tenant previously, they've got really good behavior in terms of the other credit that they are paying. Our C tenants are tenants that have either average payment profile, but often they can be tenants with thin files. In other words, there's not enough data across all the bureaus to either give them a good score or a bad score. And this typically happens with our C tenants. Therefore, it is really important that the affordability assessment is properly performed. So what is the income? What is the rent that they're applying for? And bank statements to understand, because the credit bureaus, we look at credit behavior. So how they're paying their other credit providers, their insurance and their telcos. But people have other expenses. They have living expenses, they have grocery expenses, they have petrol expenses, they have utility expenses, they have school fee payment expenses. What do those other expenses look like in determining an affordability assessment? So where you've got a T tenant, you have to, a C tenant, you have to dig a little deeper. And this for me was why we were developing the bank statement integration. One, you can turn an application around quite quickly. Two, you cut out all the fraud of people supplying fraudulent documentation. And three, we have sight of people's other expenses that aren't included in their credit profile. If I'm to look at Centurion, I love Centurion and how it's performed, and Pretoria to a certain extent as well. Now, Centurion and Pretoria are government employed kind of areas. And so during the lockdown, what we saw is the good standing ratio really didn't deteriorate as much as, say, the Gauteng central area did, which had a much more significant deterioration in terms of payment profile. So Centurion, only a 5% vacancy rate. That just is fantastic. You can see the delinquency rates are really, really low in the Centurion area. And we still have, acceptable capital growth in those areas as well. Erasmus Park, there's a nice one that stands out from a Pretoria East kind of perspective as well.
Interesting.
Let's go look at the Western Cape. Now, in the Western Cape, remember what I said about gross yield. Gross yield is a factor of what your average rental is divided by per annum, divided by your market value. And we know in the Western Cape, the properties are really expensive. So that means if your properties are really expensive and you're not able to keep your rent up in line with your the value of your property, it means that your yield is going to be a lot lower. And that's exactly what we see in the Western Cape. Those are the blue bars. And you can see that the Western Cape as a whole has, for sectional title property, has a gross yield of 8.6%.
Yeah,
Versus
that is
it's
sorry,
low,
that's
right?
exactly what I've been experiencing because I've recently moved, well, recently about a year and a half ago, moved to Cape Town, and I was trying to find the same areas that I'd been investing in Joburg, the same kind of yields, and it's not a market for your rental yield,
And
unfortunately.
it's because house prices are so much more expensive. It really
100%.
is because the market value of the properties are so much more expensive. So where do you want to go? Well, you want to go to the northern suburbs. So if you look at the northern suburbs, you can see that the gross yield is the best there at 9.1%. And that's because it's a more affordable area that you're looking at. And of course, the Western Cape, from a collections perspective, just really does outperform the rest of the country. It always has. It sits on average at 84% in good standing. Now, in Q2, 84% of the Western Cape is in. Sorry, I lied. 83% of the Western Cape is in good standing, versus Gauteng, which is sitting at 78% or 76%. And the national average sitting at 80%. So Gauteng is a really difficult province to collect rent from. Oh, what we love about Gauteng, though, is 50% of all of South Africans' tenants live in Gauteng. And that's, you've got fabulous demand. The Western Cape are a really good paying population. They pay their rent really, really well. And you can see that the vacancy rates are at 11%, so just above national average at the moment. So you are dealing with some vacancies in that area. So let's look at the Western Cape investment grade suburbs. And I've looked at it again at sectional titles. So I'm not looking at full title properties here. I'm looking at sectional titles. And remember, we're looking at the total returns. So I'm going to jump straight into Mykonos, right? Oh, my sweet
Oh my
soul.
gosh.
18% capital growth per annum for the last 10 years. So we're looking in, and I went back and I had a look. So when I share this data, I'm not going to lie, guys. When I share this data, I look at each suburb individually. I go into a lot of detail to understand what is going on there, what are the volumes of transactions, trying to understand how much we can, how much the backstory. So one of the suburbs that I didn't put into this that popped up was Retreat and Val de Vie. So let's talk about Val de Vie. Val de Vie had a 30% capital growth. And so you go and you look at the data and you say, oh, but yeah, that's because we're selling land, then we're developing it, and then we're selling a developed property afterwards. So it would appear that you're getting a huge capital growth, but it's not. It's because there's been development that you're not seeing in the deeds data in order for you to determine the price that it was bought at versus the price that it was sold at. So we strip that out of the data and we say, well, that's not a true indication of capital growth within that area. I looked at a Retreat. Retreat is another area in the southern suburbs, and we looked at Retreat, and it also seemed to have really good capital growth. And yet when I went and I looked at it, I could see that in the 2018 year, there was a complex that was brought on board. In that particular complex, the transactions were transacting at 30% more than the average of the transactions in the preceding year. And then in 2019, you see the numbers drop back down. So there, and it's a small area, so that you can see one complex within that area can have a significant effect on the behavior of that area. So we look at the data and we try and strip out those anomalies out of the data. So for me, I love the northern suburbs from an income, a gross yield perspective, and you can see that on the whole, the delinquencies are not so bad. You go into an area like Para, though, you're going to need to tighten your assessment of your city.
Grassy Park looks interesting in the southern suburbs as well.
Yes, right. Again, you see in that particular area, you've got to look out for your delinquencies. It's all about placement. For me, delinquencies can be overcome simply
But I
with
mean, just you compare that
placement.
to the numbers we were looking at from Joburg suburbs. I mean, that risk is half of what you were seeing there.
But look at the capital growth. Remember, the capital growth in
Yeah,
Gauteng was below 5%. Pretty much all the properties were sitting below
sure.
5%.
Yeah,
Now your capital growth in the Western province is sitting between 5 to 10%. And remember, that's 5 to 10% per annum
yeah,
that you've held onto the property. So if you're looking at an 8% growth and you've got inflation sitting at, let's call it 3 to 4%, you're still well above inflation, which means that you've got real capital growth, capital appreciation in your
sure.
properties. Okay, so that's the Western Cape suburbs. And then let's pop across to KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal, oh, such a struggle, hey? It's the second worst performing from a collections perspective. So it and Gauteng kind of oscillate between who are the two worst performing provinces. Currently, KwaZulu-Natal sitting at 77.8% good standing on a whole, but you go to an area like Pietermaritzburg and that's up to 87%. Vacancies in Pietermaritzburg down to 7%. Vacancies on the North Coast, 1.5%. And eThekwini is sitting at 14%. So Durban, that Durban area is where the vacancies are struggling the most. And then you go and have a look at your gross yield. So your gross yields are sitting at around about 10%. So how do gross yields work? It's fascinating. If you have a ratio of 1% market, 1% rental value, remember I said a 3,000 Rand rental, divided by a 300,000 Rand property, that's 1%, that'll always give you a 12% gross yield. So if your value of your rental is 1% of the value of your market value of your property, that'll always give you a 12% yield. As your market value of your property goes up, and we end up with a property that is a 2 million Rand property. Well, you're not going to achieve 1%. You're not going to achieve a 200,000 Rand rental to that. Sorry, 20,000 Rand rental to that. Typically, you're going to get a 12,000 Rand rental to that. And that means that your yield will go down. So your yields will always go down if your market value doesn't keep up to that 1%. And so when you look at an area like North Coast, you know that you've got a higher value properties than when you look at an area like eThekwini itself, where your properties are more affordable. So what does that mean from a investment grade suburbs? These are the top 20 investment grade suburbs when we look at total returns on investment properties. Hildene is outperforming at 16%.
That is amazing.
Capital growth. And that's in Hillcrest. So where is Hildene for those people who don't know? That's in the Hillcrest area, and there's some fabulous properties in that sort of more inland type area. And then you've got, but again, remember, if you've got properties that have high capital growth, you're typically losing out in terms of your income, of your gross yield. That there's an inverse relationship between those two. You take areas on the North Coast. These are fascinating. I mean, that Kwaduza area is a huge area that goes all the way up the North Coast. And there's been a lot of development going on in that particular area as well. And in your South Coast, Hibadine is the one that pops with capital growth, equal amount of gross yield and a very small delinquency rate in that particular area.
Yeah, sure. Still some good suburbs, but I wouldn't say as good as the Western Cape and Gauteng. Like you said,
Right.
a lower performer.
Okay, so you asked me to pull out some particular suburbs. So I brought Kempton Park in here, and I did a few things with this. I said, well, let's look at Kempton Park. The average good standing is 75%. So that's below the average good standing for the province, which we know is sitting at 77%. But our tenants that rent between 7,000 and 12,000 Rand per month, their good standing in Kempton Park is 84%. This is what's so important about the data. Not only do we need to look at the data and drill down into the suburb, but within the suburb, there are properties that perform better than other properties. So our good standing ratio for Kempton Park on the 4 suburbs that you asked me to profile, Kempton Park, our 7 to 12,000 Rand tenants are our best performing tenants. We've got a gross yield of 13.6%. If we take the delinquencies out, we've got an effective yield of 10.4%. Our capital growth is shocking. It's 1.9%. You take inflation off that, and we're actually going negative. But our total returns per annum then are 15.5%. The average property value in Kempton Park is 813,000 Rand for a sectional title property. I'm then going to look at Rosettenville, which I've highlighted as our delinquent suburb. Wasn't quite as bad as Soweto or the suburb that you profiled earlier, Lawrence. The good standing here in this particular suburb is 55%. The best performing tenants in the suburb are 3,000 to 4,500 Rand rentals, so they improved to 58%. Our gross yield is 13.5%. If we take the delinquencies out, our effective yield is 8.4%. Our capital growth is not bad as far as Gauteng is concerned at 5.8%. Therefore, our total return is 19.3%. The average cost of a property for sectional title in Rosettenville at the moment is 369,000 Rand. Then we've got
sorry, just quickly go back to that one. So it's interesting because what you've mentioned is, as much as that good standing ratio, if it's negative, it's not always a deal breaker if you manage the tenants correctly.
Yes.
And I say this because I do have an investment in this area, and although it's not the best performer, or from a financial perspective, it's fine. But the good standing is probably sitting at about 75%, and that's just because the property is well maintained, it's in the right area, and we vet the tenants and we do the right inspections. So to your point, high risk doesn't mean not investable.
No, high risk means high reward if you manage a property. So I have properties in Windsor East. Oh, my sweet soul. It's just as delinquent as Rosettenville is showing at the moment as well. And this is why I love these 300,000 Rand properties, because you can get 4,500 Rand rental for a 300,000 Rand property, which means that your gross yield is sitting at 17, 18%. And if you vet your tenant properly, you sit with 100% good standing. So I'm very particular. I'd rather my property stands vacant for a month than I put in a dodgy tenant. Just and here's the other thing. You're competing against other properties in the area. So your property needs to be well maintained. If you put in if you look after your property, you maintain it properly, you're going to
attract good tenants. That's a necessary evil, but it's better to pay up front to get a good tenant then.
Absolutely. 100%. So high risk, high reward. Berea, inner city. We're sitting with a good standing ratio of 60.25%. Did you know that City and Suburban, just down the road from it, sits with a good standing ratio of over 80%? And Bellevue, which is sitting up there in the corner, was one of our top performing from the top 20 that we put in. So, and this is the point. You can have a suburb sitting right next to each other that perform fundamentally different because of the neighborhood that it's in, and security is such a big important consideration for tenants. So tenants tell us that the top two factors that will impact where they rent is the price point and whether the property is secure enough. These are the two things that attract tenants. So your price point, your security, and of course keeping your property in good nick. So our good standing ratio here is 60%, but our 3,000 to 4,500 Rand tenants are our best performing at 67%. Our gross yield is 19%, and our delinquency not quite as bad as Rosettenville. So our effective yield is 14.5%. Capital growth not great, 3.5%. I mean, inflation is 3.5%. Real return is
the inverse of gross yield, right? You take one or the other.
Yeah. So our total return is sitting at 21.5%, and our average property value is 212,000 Rand. Again, this allows investors to choose areas that they can access. To go and purchase a 212,000 Rand property versus trying to purchase a 800,000 Rand property for an investor, especially one that's getting into the market. That's a big difference, 25% of the value. Sure. Then we did 4 ways. Four ways, we spoke about capital growth in this particular area. We've got a good standing ratio of 70%. The best performing is 7 to 12,000. Our gross yield is only 11%, but our effective yield remains at 8.3%, given our delinquencies are low. Our capital growth at 6.7%, so our total return is 12.8%. And that, Lawrence, is the end of my slideshow.
That was amazing. Michelle, you never disappoint. Thank you so much. I think that was quite an eye-opener. There are some questions here regarding how people can get this kind of information. Tracy asked, for instance, how can I get the information for Century City, and how can I determine how that area is performing? What steps do you recommend?
So getting access to our data from an analytics perspective is dead easy. You go to shop.tpn.co.za. Once you're on the shop,
there's a call to action. It's a button. Just click it and we'll take you to that website. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lauren. Call to action, please click the green button, guys. The shop.tpn.co.za then has the opportunity for you either to do a property valuation report, so you can go in and have a look at a property specifically, and you'll get the market value of the property, the high and the low, and who currently owns it, and what they bought it for, and how long ago they bought it, and how much it was bonded for. This is very, very useful information for you to determine how determined they are to sell, and sort of what their profit or loss is when you're determining what your offer is. Guys, you don't offer at the moment what the asking price is of the property. You absolutely offer less, and in my mind, you always start with a minimum of 10% less, but in certain instances, you go 20 or 30% less. You know what? If you buy your dream home, by all means, be emotional. If you're buying an investment property, you take the emotion out of it and you run the numbers.
Would you say that a 20% discount is kind of achievable in this market if you had to put a blanket on the...
Yeah, dead easy.
Is it?
And if it's not, that wasn't the right property. Move on.
Yeah, then it's an emotional buy, not an investment buy.
Guys, right now, this is the time that we buy at a discount, and we get that discount, we really, really go hardball. And you negotiate up from there. If you're going to negotiate, you negotiate up. But where you start, that's you can't go down from that. Then we've got the investor report. Oh, one other thing. On the property valuation report, I give two useful pieces of information that I don't give in the investor report. On the property valuation report, I give a scatter chart of what the rentals are in the area, which is really, really cool. But I also give the rent per square meter for the area. That's very cool. And I do it based on the size of the property. So your rent per square meter for a below 60 square meter unit is different to your rent per square meter for a 60 to 80 square meter unit, which is different to your rent per square meter for above 80 square meters. Every single area has a different rate per square meter, and it has a different rate per square meter depending on the size of the property. The property valuation report has that particular information in it. It's really cool. Then in the investor reports, we give all the data regarding the good standing ratio, how many properties have been sold, what the average purchase price of the properties is over a time series, which is where I looked at Retreat and I said, something in that area happened in 2018 that spiked the prices up and dropped them back down. So we're going to pull that out of our top performing suburbs. So you've got, what is the market value of the properties? What is the average purchase price of the properties? How many properties are transacting in that area at the moment? Because you're not just looking right now at what you're buying for. You're looking at what your exit plan is, right? You want to know that you can exit this property when you need to exit it. What is the supply and demand? What does the interest in the area look like? What does the good standing ratio look like? What does the average rental look like? Put all that together.
And what is your opinion on the student accommodation market going forward?
It's going to be tough.
Yeah.
It's going to be tough. You don't want to be in an area that. So who's coming into student accommodation? I see Growth Point is coming into student accommodation. This is who you're competing against, guys. Respublica, which is owned by Redefine. These are who you are competing against. Eris Properties brought on 2,500 properties this year in student accommodation, and we know what happens when the institutions get involved. right? When both the listed and the unlisted funds, when they come in and they get involved and they bring in 1,000 properties in an area in one go, you are now competing against their brand new properties, and they're going to put in a deposit-free first month's rent or first 2 months rent-free to get people into the properties. That's what you're competing against. So you've got to know your market, and you've got to know who else is in your market, because that's who you're competing against.
And what about the new build strategy? And I'm sure you've heard of the Section 13(6) Act. What, as a property investor, what do you think of that strategy?
So I'm not well versed enough, Lawrence, to comment, and I'm
Sure.
just not gonna.
Okay, fair enough. Airbnb, do you have an opinion on that
Well, so
strategy?
Airbnb is tough, eh? Airbnb is tough. So
Okay.
we know occupancies in hotels are at 50%. It's the worst performing commercial sector in the market at the moment. There's an oversupply of properties. Why? Because we don't have international tourists at the moment. We have much less disposable income. So people from a holiday perspective are less inclined to travel at the moment. And the third thing is that we don't have business travel. So all three of those travel sectors are down, and that's going to impact your Airbnb. So, and we've seen it. We've seen the Airbnb properties coming into the long-term lets and disrupting the long-term lets at the moment.
Look, I mean, Ramaphosa is speaking tonight, Uncle. So hopefully he's going to bring us down to lockdown 1, and hopefully by the end of the year the travel starts to pick up again. Because I think
until wave 4 starts on the 2nd of December, right in time for holidays.
True. Yeah, that is. You're right. It is
When is
tough.
the wave starting? The actuaries at Momentum and Discovery are saying 2nd of December, and that is peak holiday season.
Hectic. On your property investments, what are you currently looking at and focusing on as your own portfolio grows?
So I don't just sit with my own investments. I am on the board of one of the listed funds, and I can see that discounts, properties that are in that midsection, that sweet spot that I spoke about, family accommodation, 2 bedrooms are doing incredibly well. What we can see is 48% of all the searches on our Rent Bay website are for 2 bedrooms, 22% are for 1 bedrooms, and around about 20% for 3 bedrooms. So 2 bedrooms are performing incredibly well. Affordability is key. Affordability is key at this stage, yeah.
What tips can you give us investors when we're trying to vet a tenant so that we can, place the right person as opposed to a troublemaker?
The troublemaker. So what we've seen in the data is that if you have a tenant that we're dealing with from a noise or an inspection, so damage to property, typically these type of tenants do not come in isolation of only noise. It is there is a payment behavior pattern that is associated with that. So we for me, placing a tenant, I want to see a tenant that is an A or a B or a C. And if I see a C, then I want to be able to make sure that I've done my affordability assessment. If I've got a husband and wife, I want to have a look at both of them. If I've got a brother and sister moving in together, I want to have a look at both of them. If I've got a parent and a student, I want to have a look at both of them. Not only do I want to have a look at both of them, but I want to contract with both of them. Because if things turn bad, then I've got 2 people that I can go after for unpaid rent. So this is important to me. I want to do a full rent check. I want to understand their previous credit behavior. I want to understand their previous rental behavior.
Yeah.
So I want to do the full suites of inquiries. Then it's not just I placed a quality tenant. I want to make sure my tenant stays quality. So TPN, when you submit your data to us, we SMS your tenant to thank them for paying their rent on time and to reward them with a quality credit profile, or to remind them that their late, partial, or non-payment has resulted in their credit profile being adversely listed, because that is behavioral change. If you simply communicate with your tenant when they've turned delinquent, it's too late. It's too late. You've got to be communicating with your tenant every single month. When you send your invoice has an impact on how the tenant pays. So if you send your invoice to the tenant between 10 and 7 days before when the rent is due, there is a 20% improvement on paid on time. Simply by sending out your invoice 7 days before it's due will result in a 20% improvement on your paid on time ratio.
That's crazy. Okay. Phenomenal. Michelle, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and not only your knowledge, your time.